Social Music Talk with Alex Cosper. Thanks for joining us again. Today, we look deeper into music as we do each week, and we're going to get deeper into the data side of things. But what I want to talk about first is music and how our guest has worked in music and has worked his way toward data science. And that's John Rosenfelder. Thanks for joining us today, John.
Pleasure to be with you.
A business intelligence analyst, right?
Mm-hmm. Close enough.
So we're going to talk about that and your background in music. You were at Island Def Jam Records.
Among others, yeah. That one was the largest or most recent in a way, but also worked in Disney Music Group and lots of labels before that, Geffen and DGC and so on.
Wow. So when did you start in the music industry?
In the mid-'80s.
Oh, I started in radio around the mid-'80s.
I started as a radio person. I was a college radio music director at Stony Brook University in New York,
That's
WUSB.
where Howie Klein went.
Mm-hmm. And we were FM by that time. Howie was in the WUSB AM period. And and I knew him from those days. He was the head of 415 Records.
Right, owner, and then he went on to become the president of Reprise Records and vice president of Warner Brothers Records in the 90s.
Yes, and my career after Stony Brook was as a promotion person in the college and underground part of the music business for many, many years.
Underground, so you promoted underground bands.
Yeah, and tried to make them overground and bring them to life, I guess.
And did you have any successful examples of that?
The biggest, most successful example has to be Nirvana.
Okay.
Plenty of others that made improvements and incremental improvements, hopefully on every one of them, but that was an avalanche.
I'm curious about that because I saw on your Facebook page the past week you with Danny Goldberg, who was the manager of Nirvana.
Right.
And he's doing a book signing party because he just put out a book about Nirvana, right?
Right. Serving the Servant, I think it's called. And I'm in that book, so I went to the party.
Wow. So tell us about how you made it in that book.
Well, I was the college and metal promotion person for DGC, which was Nirvana's label when Nevermind came out, and had some interesting stories and experiences that Danny wanted to share and use as examples of how they went from being not underground particularly, but an indie band and transitioned to a major label and, of course, had all this success.
They were on Sub Pop, which was considered indie back then.
It
and
sure
the
was.
king of indie labels, as a matter of fact.
Yes, it was very popular, the Singles Club, and the whole culture of indie music in Seattle was really defined and enhanced and propagated by that company, mostly.
So you were based in L.A., but you were dealing with Nirvana, who were based in Seattle.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
In what capacity?
When I guess when they were thinking about coming to the label, we met with them and went to see them as a team. The promotion people from DGC were in Seattle to help launch another band on our label, the Posies. We all went to see Nirvana play a famous show at the Motorsports Garage together. They visited us in L.A., and then subsequently, when Nevermind came out, I was the person who took them to radio stations with help from other folks in the label. I was a relatively junior person, but...
What was funny is once Nirvana broke, they didn't do radio interviews. Say, like, I was programming Quad in Sacramento. They would not talk to someone in Sacramento, maybe in Seattle or L.A., key markets. But they were a group that stood out as one that didn't do typical radio interviews.
The leader of the group, Kurt Cobain, was certainly the person to be interviewed most of the time, and he may not have liked it that much.
That's what it seemed like. Like he sensed that radio interviews aren't always the deepest, and he seemed bored with those kind of questions.
Possibly. In my experience, he did at least 3 or 4 of them that I can think of, and he was enthusiastic about the radio stations I took him to, at least. So,
would that be in Seattle?
Yeah, in Seattle, we did a few with Susie Tennant, the local rep up there, and
Right.
one of those was a college station, KCMU, which became KEXP later, and others in L.A., including KXLU at Loyola, which was the first spin of Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Wow. Okay. I don't know if you just heard, but KLOS in Los Angeles just got sold to another company. So there goes another rocker that's going to disappear, probably.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe
Really?
not. Hopefully not. We don't know yet, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe you know more than I do.
No,
but
not really. Not really. But 90s alternative rock seemed to be what was becoming the culmination of decades of rock popularity. It was all moving toward that alternative sound. But I think in the 2000s, either oversaturation or the combination of just too many choices caused alternative to kind of just disappear as a major force in music. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, and since you mentioned my current work is in business intelligence, these all are examples of business intelligence, whether KLOS is going to continue as a rock station or when you talk about the demise or transformation of the alternative radio format, it expanded dramatically in the 90s in the wake of Nirvana and a lot of those groups' success.
No doubt.
But if you owned a radio station in the 2000s and you thought about how that audience or target demographic, right, might have moved on to different devices, different platforms, as we say now, and the potential to sell advertising to an audience on radio, listening to those FM frequencies, it might make sense to try a different format. These are all the things that are things we do every day as either business people or in our personal lives. We take in information and process it and sort of act on it. And that's
well, that's what the radio biz is going through right now. Lots and lots of decision making because, it used to be the top radio stock went for $50 a share. Now it's less than $10 a share. It's like not the industry you would invest in if you were really serious about the future, unless it gets involved more deeply involved with tech, which it does. It kind of lags the tech industry. I think if radio had gotten together with Apple and those companies more in the early 90s or mid 90s and merged with it more, it wouldn't have been trampled and controlled by the tech industry, which is what it seems like is happening.
It's a gradual process, and none of us could have really predicted how things might have turned out or which companies to bet on and not.
That's true.
A name comes to mind as you said that, which was Real Networks, right? And wasn't that Mark Cuban's company, and wasn't he part of
he had broadcast.com. I don't know the whole Mark Cuban story.
Right, but I think he was in that transformation of FM and that
to
and
podcasting
programming
and streaming.
To streaming, and online ways of listening to music and talk shows and so forth.
Well, is that where you think the world is today, more of a streaming world? Or do you think, I know that the raw numbers say that a lot of people still listen to radio in their cars, like 260 million people, but it's usually for a reduced amount of time compared to the old days. It's like 20 minutes at a time. Whereas podcasting is more geared toward the targeted listener who wants to listen to something specific, not just something general. Tell us what your view is right now of where podcasting is today.
It's obviously enormously popular. It's growing in popularity. The idea of being able to listen to things on demand and very similar to the college radio scene, how you could have programs that were very narrowly focused, on a specific topic, are what are alive in the world of podcasting and streaming. Is that you can listen to or create a program of anything you want. You're not constrained by commercial concerns, and you can find an audience for it through the online search engines and social media and so forth, and you can promote yourself. It's these things all...
It knocks down barriers of entry.
Correct. I was going to say disrupted, that old word.
Right. So tell us about what you're doing.
Well, what I did was I was in one of these large companies doing underground music promotion or alternative music. And as these other channels became available, it became, and the price of entry changed, it became less profitable or sensible for those companies to invest in this sort of world. And I went from being a corporate promotion and artist development person to doing it on my own as an independent for many years. It took me a long time to think of what to do next. A lot of my friends went into real estate, other sorts of sales type jobs. You could almost say business-to-business relationship management if you wanted to be fancy. But I really loved music and the process and act of doing promotion. I felt I was good at it, and I wanted to keep doing it. And the statistics say that most people who become independent or some sort of consultant keep doing what they had been doing previously. But in about 2007 or 8, I got this idea that blogging and microblogging, posting on Twitter and Facebook and so forth, were a similar sort of scene as this underground music and even specialty shows on college and AAA music stations. So I added that as a feature in my independent promotion arsenal, and it really created a bump in my business. And thanks to a friend of mine who I'd made along the way as a promotion person, Dan Patterson, who was with ABC News and had his own early podcast. He might even still be doing it, the Creepy Sleepy Radio Hour or something like that. He really was very forceful as far as me starting my own blog and putting my voice out onto the net as far as being one of these folks too and transitioning into the data and tech world, let's say. And it really made a difference. I felt I had the writing ability and had an opinion about music and experiences that were worth sharing, thanks to my friend, and was offered a job back in one of these major labels in about 2007. I wouldn't do it because they wouldn't let me be a tech person or work the digital world at all. So at that point, it's almost like I burned the boats and decided to go full bore tech. I had another friend, Andy Flynn from South by Southwest, who would sometimes give me a comp pass to the conference. It's really nice, by the way, to be interviewed by you as one of the radio people I used to know in that old world. And like these other guys, took care of me in a way. And I said, I want to go to the South by Southwest Interactive Conference. And when I was at that, it was amazing to me how there were young people walking around in sneakers and T-shirts with expense accounts, going to parties that had ice sculptures, and all the sort of fun and money and energy that I had experienced in the music biz in this sort of underground new artist realm had kind of moved over into this tech region. And I said, I got to try and do that. I got to follow the ice sculptures, basically. And after that, I was lucky enough to very gradually build some credentials and contacts in tech and data and social media and so forth. And in about 2009, heard about a a program in Columbia University that specialized in technology management, and it was a groundbreaking program, and I just had kind of had it with promotion at that point, and decided to pursue that, and I was admitted to that program and haven't really looked back since.
So then how deep have you gotten into tech?
Well, when I was in Columbia and going into Columbia, the public version of Facebook had come out. The Gmail had been active for years. Twitter had happened in about 2007. I started with it in 2008. And all these services were free.
Yeah.
And how could they be free if they're so great? I never, I never dreamed I could have a free phone. I got charged for every phone call by Bell and AT&T and that company. It must have been the data. And between that and a exhibit I saw at the Museum of Modern Art called Design and the Elastic Mind, which had a lot of art made out of data visualizations, I realized that this was really a very powerful tool, data visualization specifically, the idea of making graphs and turning numbers into pictures for quick and very powerful understanding. And so I decided I'm gonna try that. And everything I was reading, of course, at the time was about big data. Mm-hmm. And the music business, meanwhile, was getting smaller around me. And I didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
And it kept shrinking. And artists that I would have normally been rehired to work on couldn't afford it after the financial crunch of 2008. Mm-hmm. So I really had to do something different. And so this idea of data and specifically statistics and programming and knowledge of a business domain played into this idea of becoming a data scientist and a business intelligence analyst. Mm-hmm. I read job descriptions from iTunes and a few other companies at the time. All they were hiring for was something called business intelligence analyst.
Well, there's more like engineers, or did you have to have a marketing degree, or what prerequisite do you need to be a data scientist?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, a data scientist, you have to know how to move data around from, let's say, different sources and integrate it, correct it, format it in order to create a visualization or to build statistics from it. And these are all processes in programming and conceptual ideas behind databases that, while I had done some data work by being a promotion person, took a lot of learning. So that, mm-hmm. But these things and the 4 or 5 aspects of business intelligence are programming, statistics, knowledge of a business domain, and what sort of problems you're trying to solve, communication skills, the ability to put things into a graphic format that makes sense to people, whether it's a pie graph or a line chart, et cetera, and social skills, the ability to communicate and share ideas with people of different levels of extroversion. Let's say I was a promotion person, I'm pointing at you because in your radio life, you must have known people that were very quiet and numbers-oriented people.
Sure.
And then DJs who would go on the air and be this, flamboyant performer type person. So I had worked with different personalities in my career, and I looked at these 5 skills, and that's what would be listed in these job descriptions for business intelligence. I'd say, I'm going to try and do that. And so over time, it's now 7 or 8 years, I've built some of these skills, and I knew that no matter how long it took me to learn this stuff, that if music was going to phones and streams as opposed to radio and records, mm-hmm. That somebody I knew who was still in the business would crack a door for me, mm-hmm. and need me to do that work.
Well, it seems to me that everything you've mentioned about data, what it's about, and the study of analytics, how that helps business, that any business would want to know about that.
That's true.
That's where we are now in the big data revolution.
That's right, and that's exactly what happened to me. In Columbia, I had this idea that I wanted to do it with music, but I didn't really have the skills yet. And but my thesis project was about a music search engine which would present the results in visual form, album covers, videos, pictures, as opposed to...
Kind of what Amazon does now, huh?
Yes, but at the time, in 2010 or so, these were mostly spreadsheets and sort of rows and columns. And so I had this idea that it could be presented better, and that the, let's say, knowledge management of having been a promotion person and have to make friends with radio people and create a relationship, a framework where I could recommend songs that were meaningful to them, because every radio person's different, and
Sure.
every record isn't Nirvana. So I had to find slots for things and find the right people for those things. So that idea of kind of getting a sense of what somebody's musical taste was and then suggesting the right thing was really what Spotify, iTunes, and all these services are kind of, it's a problem they're all racing to solve.
It's almost like their business is data. Like that becomes the data that makes the charts.
Correct.
Have you yourself, like I started out as a chart freak, like a dork, like a freaking Billboard joker, a junkie who just would keep up with the charts every week, and I always wanted to know the stories behind the chart positions.
Right.
And were you like that?
Of course. I was a promotion person for
Okay.
25 years, and like I said, not every record was Nirvana and went number one on its own or without a lot of help or discipline behind it. As a promotion person, I used numbers from all over the country. I do a presentation where I show a list of records I made when I was 7 years old of Jackson 5 songs. I'm not unique. I'm sure you made lists of songs when you were a kid.
Every week.
And when we talk about data and music, I want everybody listening to this to know that all we're talking about is lists of songs, lists of artists, lists of countries, etc. And yes, as a promotion person, but going back to when I was music director, I would take, I had my own playlist for a radio show. And then I would take the other playlists and consolidate them and make one playlist for the radio station. Then when I was a promotion person, my job was to manage all those playlists and create some sort of result in aggregate, the chart number, that would be better than the other records I was competing against. My business intelligence about the other records versus mine dictated which radio stations I would go for from week to week to build my records profile to a number one project. And I always give the example of Elvis Costello, When I Was Cruel, and how I broke up the radio stations that Elvis had versus Wilco, the number one record. He was number two for 4 weeks, into a Venn diagram. One side Elvis, one side Wilco, and then in the middle, the stations they shared. And this was faxed out to my promotion team so that they would know which stations to prioritize in the next 5 days before the coming Tuesday to generate a number one. So yes, the more I got into data and statistics, the more I realized I'd been doing it all along. And I'm going to the baseball game after this.
Oh, yeah, right.
Baseball data and those statistics have been a huge part of my life. Fantasy baseball and baseball cards and the statistical aspect of baseball is ingrained in my thinking and helped guide me along all these difficult challenges of learning statistics and programming and so forth. I can show you a pile of books that are all about this topic of baseball data and programming and so forth.
So do you include the 1919 World Series that was thrown out because it was considered rigged?
Well, I'll tell you something. You could, but the main thing about that goes back to what you were saying about the stories behind all the songs on the charts. And when you mentioned the 1919 World Series, I think about a building near where I used to live in New York, where they planned the Black Sox heist on Broadway and 74th Street, the former Ansonia Hotel that coincidentally Babe Ruth lived in, but he wasn't part of that scam. But that's where these famous gangsters planned the Black Sox thing. And so that...
so there are roots in reality that you could point to
right.
say this.
Absolutely. One thing I'd like to make clear to you and everybody listening is that data is people. And music data is not just lists of songs, but it's all the actions and feelings that generate those lists of songs. Like I said, my list of Jackson 5 songs when I was 7 years old, my list of songs I played on WUSB versus the songs Howie Klein played on WUSB, or the songs Howie Klein wanted me to play as head of 415 Records and all that stuff. Everything.
Romeo Void.
Right. Everything. In my time, it was Wire Train. And I made friends with Howie by producing a contest-winning radio special about Wire Train in order to bring new technology into my radio station, his old radio station, a CD player. So, it all kind of ties together, but these things hopefully make me a better data scientist and make you and everyone else who does radio or thinks of songs or baseball players or reads a traffic report before they decide which route to take to work, data scientists in their own way.
That's what my website has become. It's playlistresearch.com, and it's basically a series of playlists on every kind of theme you could think of, eras, styles. It's about 1,000 pages worth of data.
Right. And how you would came up with those lists is probably from research.
Yes, Joel Whitburn books, all kinds of chart books, music books.
Integrating different sources of data to come up with a reliable solution to a question, which is what I was talking about, except with programming and applications that do that sort of thing.
More like instant answers through an interactive application rather than just a website full of information.
Well, it could be. Since you mentioned it, let's talk about applications and how people on the other end of this microphone or people listening to this program might learn and do some of this work themselves. You interact with a database using SQL, structured query language, and that's how you would break the history of music or a long list of transactions or streams into cities, genres, demographics, etc., like you were talking about, exist on your website. You would write a query that would pull a subset from this history of music or what your sales had been to answer a set of questions.
Right,
Simple
like how
as
many
that.
units did it sell in this market during this period?
After that television program was on and in what age group. And instead of showing you a list of numbers on a spreadsheet, I'm going to show you a graph or some visual representation of that long list of numbers so that you can immediately understand it.
So
that's the whole name of the game.
For your business that you're talking about, are you integrating a lot of different resources, say like Nielsen and Billboard and all of those data producing companies? Are you putting them all together in one place? In
a enterprise business intelligence department, you might have 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 different people that are part of the, say, data assembly line, where folks are cleaning the data, integrating it, validating it to make sure that it's correct, They might make connections with these outside companies and deal with whatever security protocols are involved with making those connections. They're going to check the feeds to make sure that there's accuracy and that there's not a huge number of rows different than the day before or the year before. They're going to have some sort of benchmark. There are other folks who are going to do calculations or math against it. At Tory Burch, my first job out of Columbia, a fashion company, right? You mentioned before that other people and other businesses need this work. Mm-hmm. Yes, I shot for the moon to work in music, but I also knew that if I missed, that someone else would want me. And what happened was that one of my professors from Columbia hired me to work in a fashion company, even though I didn't know a thing about women's fashion, nor data even at that point, really, except for the fact that I really was intensely focused on learning the stuff and getting better at it. And whether it led back to music or not was an unknown question at that point.
You know, it's really interesting about music and data, how they are following a parallel path in a way ever since the 90s.
Earlier.
Earlier.
People have always interacted with the history of music using data.
Okay.
Anybody that ever went to
charts.
Anybody that ever went to a record store where there were genres in the bins.
Right.
Anybody that ever went to a classical music store as opposed to a jazz store or pop store or
it was organized based on data.
They had, quote, curators that decided which the genre or area of music they were going to specialize in. And these were ways that we were enabled to learn things, radio stations that focused on a certain genre. Mm-hmm. And you would also go to the record store and they would have posted a chart that would help you organize or understand what was happening at that moment, that, quote, snapshot of that week. Right. These are all terms in databases and business intelligence. Give me a snapshot. Show me what's happening now as opposed to the entire history.
And that's how artists' career stories are built, right? On these snapshots, a series of snapshots that capture a lot of data for a short period of time.
Sure. We talk about how the Beatles had the top 5 all at once. Yeah. Every song in the top 5 was a Beatles song. You mentioned the rise or demise of genres and radio stations. That validity of that chart is based on how many stations report, mm-hmm. right?
Right.
How many people it represents. Data is people.
Did you ever question the validity of Billboard and these and Cashbox and Record World and those kind of trade magazines, knowing the methodology?
Yes and no. I was in a area of music that was supposedly the most credible and the least corrupt of all music business, right, and most unaffected by commerciality. I often talk about how I worked one data-driven project in my whole career, Nirvana, but there were some radio stations that would not play them.
Too hard. Right?
Yeah, they were considered
edgy.
They would later become part of the foundation of the AAA format.
Yeah.
But at that point, they were alternative rock radio stations, and it was, like you said, too edgy and so on.
And these are just perceptions.
But yes, the idea that one chart or format is more valid, or how I still haven't answered your question about whether or not I believed in the methodology or how. Yeah. Yes, of course. I was a Yankee fan. Billy Martin kicked dirt on umpires that he thought had made a bad decision or wanted to influence their next decision. Yes, I had a Venn diagram comparing Wilco's radio stations to Elvis Costello's. I was into the mathematics behind that chart as a way to influence what happened. And of course, each one of those radio stations had its own methodology for creating its chart too. They weren't just based on spins. They were based on some of the radio stations made a chart that was just in alphabetical order, you know? Because all the records
took it seriously.
Well, let's say they're in alphabetical order because all the records are tied.
Yeah.
They all have the same number of spins that week.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course, that's how you that's how I at least became was considered an effective promotion person. I would not have been able to do it for 25 years if I wasn't good at influencing charts.
So did you think
and
that
understanding the methods?
When Billboard introduced SoundScan in 1991, it radically changed the charts. Suddenly Garth Brooks had a #1 album out of nowhere, and I guess it became more accurate.
and Nirvana beat Michael Jackson's Dangerous in Christmas week.
So, because of that new methodology, that was good for the industry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
It woke up an industry that was falling asleep on this old system, right? That where numbers they fell into this big gray area and they influenced things in ways they shouldn't have.
Well, yes, it did, but the folks at the top of those record companies that decided which records to put money on, right?
The priorities, yeah.
But to put money on them, right? To bonus the staff, to buy advertising on the radio stations, to rent a tour bus for the band to enable them to get from town to town, but also to enable them to do morning radio shows. These were hopefully considered decisions made by people that were somewhat scientific.
And not just throwing money at bands.
Yeah, there's an old promotion guy I know of who tells a story about how he was excited to tell his boss that he had achieved a certain chart position or a certain number of ads on radio, and the guy said, "I should fire you right now," because he had put money on a record that didn't deserve it or wasn't going to come through with the audience and deliver on this spend. He had just artificially propped up something that shouldn't have been propped up.
Stack some promotions to get some ads on some for the chart to make it look like the record moved up when nothing really happened.
Right, but at the same time, there are certainly people in the industry, gatekeepers, music directors, who would respond to something that had money on it.
Mm-hmm.
I saw your double truck ad in Billboard. You guys are really bullish on this project. You really believe in it. Fleetwood Mac Tusk is going to be humongous. Why wouldn't you bet on Fleetwood Mac Tusk? And the difficulty if you're the record company is you've had Rumors, this monstrous album.
Right.
And
biggest of all time in that category.
And you know that this next record doesn't have 3 or 4 hits on it. Like
even though it's a double album.
it doesn't have the hits that Rumors has on it. Mm-hmm. We have to somehow get through to the audience, get through these gatekeepers to reach the audience and let them know the project's out. It's a real dilemma.
So, I mean, numbers really are what drive stories and records up the charts.
At Columbia, they said if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And at that moment, it became crystal clear to me why radio promotion departments and sales departments drove every record company I'd ever been in, because those were the only departments where anything measurable occurred. And those record companies were run by MBAs and lawyers with big degrees and so forth. They were smart folks, but that was all they could measure their success by.
But somewhere along the line, the story has to begin with a real story, right? A band story. Starts with what? When
we talk about the best record company people I know, we mentioned Chris Blackwell from Island Records before.
Mm-hmm. Right.
My best record company presidents, David Geffen, Johnny Barbas, Leor Cohen, and on and on. I happen to have been associated with some of the best ever. Those were the decisions that they were good at.
By looking at data and making...
No, by trusting their feelings combined with data.
Okay.
Each one of them has books and interviews and so forth where they'll talk about how, no, David Geffen's the first person to say, I had no idea Nirvana was going to be as big as it was until I saw that they were #1 in Greece. Then it blew my mind. Holy smokes, these guys, have really done it. He didn't. I gave David Geffen's chauffeur a cassette of Nevermind. I said, make sure David listens to this. But I had no data to back up my feeling that this was going to be an important project. I just said, make sure David knows about this one. Chris Blackwell would support projects like, I just saw the CD the other day of the soundtrack to the movie about Nelson Mandela, Son of Africa, Father of a Nation, a movie about Nelson Mandela that came out in the 90s. Chris Blackwell was very bullish on that project. He was also he also gave us some talks about the forthcoming U2 album, Pop, where it was obvious that he didn't think it was going to be as commercial probably as
Octune Baby,
as their peak albums.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So it was the data of their fandom of music that was, and the business intelligence of listening to music and knowing what to believe in and bet on and so forth.
See, that's the most important aspect of business intelligence in my world is what you're talking about, the people like Chris Blackwell having something more than a business sense to bring to the party, to have some appreciation for music, to want to take it somewhere. So tell us about your relationship with Chris Blackwell, who started Island Records.
Well, I was there for like the last 2 years of Chris Blackwell in the business as head of Island Records, and these are a couple of standout stories. He had a decentralized management style. There were 3 or 4 different presidents when I worked at Island, each in charge of different areas of the company. They talked about how there were 4 corners of the building, and each one of these 4 corner offices were kind of in competition or working for or against each other, as the case may be. But the guy's absolute genius and had the idea that, let's say, we're going to get behind the Orb or Oblivion album, for example. And it may not have been the most commercial or important project, but it added credibility and some sort of mystical quality to the other projects that we were working on, to have a so-called Chris record be a priority and at the forefront of our conversations. He was, in terms of my personal relationship with him, looking down the road 6 or 7 months past that talk about the U2 album, there was a contraction in the company. And even though I'd only worked there about 7 months, my position was eliminated. I just moved from California back to New York.
Wow.
And had the difficult task of finding an apartment in New York, and 2 weeks afterwards was let go. And meanwhile, on deck was the Scratch Perry box set, Arcology. And meanwhile, the person they replaced me with was not excited to work with reggae DJs and world music people and so forth like I was. I mentioned I was from Stony Brook. One of my favorite DJs there was the reggae host, Lister Hugh and Lowe, who had a relationship with Island of his own going back to the Black Uhuru days. And
of course, Island was the Bob Marley label.
Of course.
So it's very reggae-oriented.
The forefront. And so because I had been reconnecting with all these world music and reggae hosts around the country who were concerned that I'd been let go and that they were now going to be adrift, and there was a big pile of Lee Perry box sets in my cubicle, Chris Blackwell ended up getting a few phone calls from various DJs around the country saying, "You let this guy go. It should really. It's not a great thing. You've made a bad decision." And Blackwell had the promotion people hire me back 2 weeks later.
Wow.
And that was an amazing experience.
Wow.
So, yeah, so he did something that was for the most underground and the most sort of commercially limited part of the label in a way. But on the other hand, a buddy of mine just emailed me, or I saw on his Facebook page, Scratch Perry is doing a art exhibit at the Swiss Embassy in New York. He ended up being able to go on tour, revived interest in Scratch Perry, this really amazing artist in the reggae arena in the mid to late 90s. And that box set helped kick it off and get it all going again for Scratch. Chris wanted those records worked, and I was the guy to do it. So
you worked at a college radio, right?
Oh, yeah. But again, we talk about AAA. Some of these AAA folks, one of my favorite memories of that project is a interview that Jody Denberg at KGSR did with Scratch Perry and the Mad Professor, which I covet the cassette of, where he had Scratch on the air and had to deal with his colorful lexicon on KGSR. So it wasn't just college people. It was some commercial guys that were adventurous too.
So data science, that's where you are today. Do you see that connecting with the average musician? Should the average musician have a deep understanding of data the way you do, how you've used it to promote music? For the musician, how much do they need to know if they're trying to start their own thing?
Well, if we consider music itself as data, and
I guess it
sheet music is data visualization.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm going to put these notes in a staff, and it's going to represent this vibration and sound data, right? And rhythms and so forth. And one of the cutting edge ideas in music and data these days is music created by artificial intelligence and machine learning. And those concepts are just taking historical data and seeing what worked in it in the past and creating something new based on those attributes, either a target sort of ideal result and shaking up this set of numbers and having it come out that way again or in a different sort of way. That's what all musicians who've ever been influenced and listened to other music are doing themselves with their brains, the most powerful computer ever. So if you're a musician and you consider yourself somebody who has an influence and you learn a certain style of singing or writing lyrics or chord progressions and all these things that make up music from listening to music of the past and synthesizing it and integrating these different sources into something new that's quote-unquote actionable. You can dance to it or feel sad to it or go to sleep to it or use it to be on a Budweiser or a commercial for the Marines and so forth, then those are all examples of using data and understanding it and creating something new out of it.
That's what Facebook wants to do, is categorize everything into those kind of categories you just said and understand each user's behavior based on categories of data that they select.
And behaviors, yeah, and what you click on and what you like and who you like and so on. As a musician, if you want to be interested in the analytics side of things, Lionel Richie used to talk about how when I knew him, he was telling stories about how when the band, the Commodores, started out, mentors of theirs in the music biz or club promoters and so forth, gatekeepers, curators in their world, said, well, what are you going to target? What are you going to be like? Whose audience do you want to have? So that gave him and the Commodores some sort of idea of what market or what type of music to make, music that excited that group of people, and lucky enough they found an audience for what they liked. When Bob Marley and the Commodores opened up for each other, they were each trying to grab some of that, to make that overlapping part of the Venn diagram a little bigger, to grab a little piece of the other's audience. That's something that's data and analytics driven. But to answer your question, a musician today can look at Facebook analytics, YouTube analytics. There are public-facing portals that enable them to understand how successful they're being with a particular audience, as opposed to the old days where you'd only know if you were successful if people actually came to your show, or there was word of mouth, or the radio station let you on during the day and the phones lit up, and all these sort of less scientific or less precise forms of measurement.
Right.
It's the same sort of thing. In fact, one of the things I want to communicate, besides that data is people, is that many of these ideas and ways that we understood music and audiences in the old days are still relevant today. You just use different means to find them out. So then I'm curious, one of the things that strikes me as very not talked about but should be in terms of data science is that Spotify and YouTube, that's starting to be the data people are quoting that is supposed to measure popularity. When those methodologies, you can actually buy, data now. So how does buying data, purchasing through a third-party vendor, how does that distort the whole equation, and does it matter? If all data becomes distorted, does it even matter? Well, once again, we're talking about very sort of anecdotal ways of measuring in the past. Phones lighting up, word of mouth at a concert, turning into tickets. But what about the band? The band who figures out how to rig Spotify so that they get zillions and zillions and zillions of streams that they're actually paying for to have money paid back to them, but in the process they get promoted. Is something happening? Well, we used to have fan clubs calling radio stations to request songs and things like this. There's plenty of ways to skew everything, right? Because once again, data's people, and none of these things are perfect. But what I would say is that you can't know everything. You can only count the change in your pocket. You can't count how much change is in all the pockets of people on this street. We don't have all that info. But if I can find out a few people, maybe I can, quote, reduce complexity. Maybe I can reduce uncertainty in coming up with that number. So let's say your job is to filter out distorted data and to find out who's really happening in your community. How would you do that? How would you filter out distorted data? Well, the best way to do it is to have a lot of data and to not corrupt it or make any intervention on your own or skew it in any way, and to be honest about the data and to look at a lot of different sources and not go into these situations with a predisposed agenda or idea of something you're trying to prove or present or promote. Let's say you're trying to discover what's out there. You want the real data. Right. And if you say you want to know how many cover bands are in your town, something like that. You can measure that. You could. The best answer for this is actually what they call a Fermi question. Fermi was a famous scientist, and he used to lead off his class at the University of Chicago and say, how many piano tuners are there in the city of Chicago? And students would raise their hand and make a guess. And then he would break this question down, say, well, there are X number of people in Chicago. And we know that about this many people play piano per capita. And we know each piano needs to be tuned about this often. And we know that a piano tuner charges about this much to tune a piano. And he'd get deeper and more granular into this question and asking more and more questions about this until he came up with an estimate how many piano tuners there might be. And then he'd have someone break out the yellow pages, and it would be in the zone. Somebody I know was once asked, how many gallons of Oreo cookie ice cream are we going to sell in Japan next year when they introduce the flavor? How do we know how many people...
That's the music that means we have 3 minutes left to talk and wrap it up.
Okay. Well, he came up with a quick answer. He was in Washington. He went to different embassies and polled people to try and get a sense of what the taste for that flavor might be, and came up with a projection.
It's all about algorithms, huh?
It's a detective story.
All right. We've been talking with John Rosenfelder, who has worked in the music biz for Island Def Jam Records and is now a data scientist who does business intelligence. How would you like to wrap this up?
I would say to remind people, data is people. And if you ever want to find me, go to earbender.com. I'll answer any questions people might have.
All right. Thank you very much, John Rosenfelder. Enjoy the Padres today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Social Music Talk on WSRadio.com. Stay tuned for the wide world of weed.